In the spring of 1943, German intelligence received a report that seemed absurd. Ford Motor Company, the car maker from Detroit, had built a factory capable of producing a 1.5 million part heavy bomber every 63 minutes. The agents who gathered the data thought it was disinformation. The Luftwaffe's top engineers dismissed it outright. Even Albert Speer, Germany's armaments minister, scrawled a question mark across the page and filed it under American exaggeration. But it wasn't. In a stretch of farmland west of Detroit, a new kind of battlefield had emerged. A mile-long assembly line where B-24 Liberator bombers rolled out like Model Ts. The factory, known as Willow Run, was the largest industrial building on Earth, and its existence violated every assumption Nazi Germany held about the United States. The Reich's spies called it the factory that shouldn't exist, and as they watched in disbelief, they began to realize a darker truth. The war wasn't being lost in the trenches or the skies. It was being lost on the assembly line. In the early years of the war, Nazi Germany's confidence in victory rested on a single assumption: that the United States, though vast and wealthy, lacked the discipline, unity, and industrial will to sustain a total war. From Berlin's ministries to the Luftwaffe's briefing rooms, American industry was seen as chaotic, too commercial, too decentralized, and too individualistic to convert car factories into engines of conquest. Adolf Hitler himself dismissed America as a nation of mechanics, incapable of grand vision. Albert Speer, head of German armaments, echoed that view in his memos, describing the United States as rich in resources but poor in organization. Through 1941 and 1942, this conviction shaped German strategy. Intelligence officers in Madrid, Stockholm, and Buenos Aires sent reports portraying America as unready and divided. They noted strikes in Detroit, racial tensions in the South, and the slow buildup of armament plants. The Nazi regime saw democracy as disorder, and disorder, they believed, could never outbuild a dictatorship. But the truth, as they would soon discover, was far more dangerous. In December 1941, after Pearl Harbor, the United States declared war, and Henry Ford, the same industrialist who had revolutionized the automobile, quietly began a project that would redefine modern production. At age 78, Ford was already a legend. His Model T had changed the world, his assembly line had reshaped labor, and his factories had proven that machinery could multiply human effort. Yet his son, Edsel Ford, understood that building cars and building bombers were two very different worlds. The U.S. Army Air Forces needed a reliable long-range bomber, the B-24 Liberator, designed by Consolidated Aircraft in San Diego. It was a powerful aircraft, 4 engines, 110 feet of wingspan, capable of carrying 8,000 pounds of bombs. But it was also the most complex machine ever mass-produced, over 1.5 million individual parts. At the start of 1942, Consolidated could produce only 1 B-24 a day. The demand, however, was for thousands. That was when the Ford Motor Company proposed the impossible: to build B-24s the way Detroit built cars, not one at a time, but hundreds a month. The chosen site lay in Ypsilanti, Michigan, on a patch of farmland surrounded by woods and dirt roads. There, engineers began constructing what would become the Willow Run bomber plant, a facility so large it required its own power grid, water supply, and airfield. The building, designed by Albert Kahn, stretched a full mile from end to end and covered 3.5 million square feet. Inside, more than 42,000 workers would eventually assemble machines of war with the rhythm of a heartbeat. To coordinate production, Ford's engineers broke the B-24 into 5,000 individual sub-assemblies, each manufactured in specialized zones, then fed onto a central moving line. It was a logistical ballet of steel and precision, the first true application of automotive mass production to military aviation. At first, the idea was met with skepticism. The Army doubted Ford could maintain aircraft tolerances at car speed. Pilots distrusted the notion of a factory-built bomber. Henry Ford himself clashed with Army inspectors, refusing to arm his planes or install gun turrets within his factory walls, citing his lifelong aversion to violence. Still, under his son Edsel's quiet leadership, and with the coordination of Charles Sorensen, Ford's production genius, Willow Run began operations in late 1942. Its initial months were chaos, parts shortages, engine failures, and misaligned wings. Newspapers mocked the plant as "Will it run?" But gradually, through relentless adaptation, it began to stabilize. By early 1943, the line was moving. Trucks carried components from Ford's River Rouge plant in Detroit. Subcontractors from across Michigan supplied aluminum, wiring, and hydraulics. Women entered the workforce in unprecedented numbers, soon symbolized by the cultural icon, Rosie the Riveter. By that spring, the first Ford-built B-24s were rolling off the line, complete, tested, and airborne. Each new aircraft was an act of defiance not just to Germany's military might, but to its ideology. Because the very system the Nazis mocked, open, improvisational, and democratic, had just created a war machine beyond their comprehension. And soon, it would start moving faster than any spy could believe. By mid-1943, a new sound echoed across southeastern Michigan, the deep, rising hum of 4 Pratt & Whitney engines testing inside the world's largest building. From dawn until midnight, that sound never stopped. Inside Willow Run, the transformation was complete. The mile-long factory floor moved like a living organism, steel flowing from one end to the other in a continuous chain of creation. Riveters hammered, cranes lifted, welders sparked, and women guided giant aluminum skeletons onto the assembly line as though choreographing an industrial symphony. Every 63 minutes, the great doors at the end of the hangar opened, and another B-24 Liberator rolled into the sunlight, fueled, tested, and ready for flight. For Nazi Germany, which prided itself on technical mastery, the idea of a factory producing a bomber an hour sounded like madness. But in the United States, it was happening in plain sight. The project's heart lay in Ford's belief that mass production could solve anything, even the logistics of global war. Where German aircraft factories relied on hand-fitting, craftsmanship, and rigid hierarchy, Ford relied on standardization and movement. Each worker, regardless of experience, specialized in one repetitive task: tightening bolts, sealing panels, testing hydraulic lines, while the parts themselves moved past on the world's longest powered conveyor. At full strength, 42,000, men and women worked in shifts covering 24 hours a day. The plant consumed more than 1 million gallons of fuel oil a week, and its cafeteria served over 15,000 meals per day. Trains delivered aluminum, copper, and steel from every corner of the country. A new community even rose around it: Willow Run Village, a vast housing project built to accommodate the flood of workers. For many, it was their first experience with industrial life. For women, it was a new kind of independence. They became welders, inspectors, assemblers, and pilots, a quiet revolution hidden inside a war. At its peak, the plant could produce 650 B-24s a month. More than all of Germany's aircraft factories combined could manage of their own heavy bombers. By the summer of 1943, German intelligence finally took notice. Reports began filtering into Berlin from neutral countries, particularly Sweden, Switzerland, Spain, and Mexico, where Nazi agents monitored Allied industry. One report from Stockholm described a giant complex under Ford's direction near Detroit, building bombers as if they were automobiles. Another, from Lisbon, claimed aerial photographs indicate a single assembly hall more than 1 mile long. But to German analysts, these claims defied reason. A factory that size would require logistics on a scale they deemed impossible. Millions of parts, endless supplies of aluminum, tens of thousands of trained workers. Their assumptions, rooted in Europe's rigid systems, could not comprehend America's decentralized power. Albert Speer, receiving these intelligence summaries, scribbled a skeptical note to his deputy: exaggerations of the enemy's propaganda. Even Ford cannot build an airplane as one builds a car. Yet, deep within the Reich's military intelligence service, the Abwehr, under Admiral Wilhelm Canaris, a handful of analysts began to suspect the reports were true. They knew Ford's history. They remembered how, during the 1920s, Ford had revolutionized Soviet auto manufacturing at Gorky. They understood the power of American industrial networks, and they feared what might happen if that same model were turned toward total war. Their fears were justified. By late 1943, Ford's Willow Run wasn't just producing bombers. It was feeding the Allied war machine worldwide. Finished aircraft flew directly from the plant's runway to England via Newfoundland. Spare engines were shipped to North Africa and Italy. Entire sections of B-24 fuselages were crated and sent to assembly plants in Dallas and Tulsa. The United States had built not just a factory, but a replicable system, a design that could be cloned anywhere in the world. In the eyes of German intelligence, Willow Run represented a terrifying concept: industrial mobility. Factories could be moved, scaled, duplicated, powered by democracy's chaos and capitalism's speed. It was the very thing Hitler had declared impossible, and now it was happening faster than his army could advance. By the time the first verified aerial reconnaissance photographs of Willow Run reached Berlin in late 1943, the reaction within the Reich Air Ministry was disbelief. One analyst wrote, "If accurate, this single plant can equal the monthly output of our entire Luftwaffe industry." But the damage was already done. The United States had found its new weapon. Not a plane, not a bomb, but production itself. In Berlin, the first whispers about Willow Run came as fragments, intercepted press releases, coded intelligence from Madrid, vague summaries from Stockholm. Each report spoke of impossible numbers. One claimed America would soon produce 80,000 aircraft a year. Another stated that Ford had constructed a single factory equal to the industrial capacity of an entire European nation. To Nazi analysts, this sounded like fantasy. But within the Abwehr, Germany's military intelligence service, a few men began to look closer. Admiral Wilhelm Canaris, head of the Abwehr, was not a blind follower of Hitler. A veteran of the First World War, he knew that wars were not won by speeches but by supply chains. He had watched Germany's own factories struggle under Allied bombing and resource shortages. When reports of Ford's vast new facility reached his desk in late 1943, he quietly ordered an independent investigation. The results stunned even him. The Abwehr's network of agents in the Western Hemisphere, particularly in Mexico, Argentina, and Brazil, was tasked with monitoring industrial shipments to the United States. Through intercepted bills of lading and dockyard records, they began to piece together something extraordinary. From ports along the Great Lakes, ships were carrying unassembled aircraft components, wings, fuselage sections, hydraulic systems under Ford's name. The quantities made no sense unless a single facility was mass-producing them at a rate unseen in modern warfare. An Abwehr agent in Mexico City, operating under the alias Karl Langen, cabled Berlin in March 1943. Ford Motor Co. appears to operate a continuous production line for heavy bombers near Detroit. If true, represents industrial power beyond comparison. This message was intercepted by Reinhard Gehlen's Military Intelligence Analysis Unit, Fremde Heere West, which handled all Western data. Their analysts flagged it as unverified but significant. By June, further evidence emerged from Sweden, where neutral observers had seen American trade magazines boasting about the world's largest factory. American propaganda, they assumed. Yet photographic prints smuggled out by sympathetic businessmen showed something real. An immense rectangular building, longer than any known hangar in Europe, surrounded by rail lines and fuel tanks. Canaris understood the implications immediately. The United States was producing aircraft at an industrial tempo that could not be matched by any centralized, command-driven system. But when he brought these findings to the Reich Air Ministry, the reaction was disbelief tinged with contempt. Hermann Göring, commander of the Luftwaffe, reportedly laughed. "An airplane every hour? Perhaps they are made of cardboard," he said during a staff meeting. According to a later memo by Albert Speer, the German leadership's failure wasn't ignorance, it was ideology. They believed efficiency came only through control. They saw democracy as chaos, freedom as weakness, and the idea of 40,000 women building bombers as absurd. They had never understood that chaos could be organized, that creativity and autonomy could produce strength. As Göring mocked, the truth kept moving, literally. On the factory floor at Willow Run, aircraft number 1500 was already taxiing out of the hangar. Meanwhile, the Abwehr's field officers pressed on. From Lisbon to Buenos Aires, they attempted to confirm production numbers by tracking aluminum shipments, engine exports, and aviation fuel. Their conclusions were alarming. By late 1943, American aluminum consumption exceeded that of all Axis nations combined. Aviation gasoline shipments were measured in billions of gallons. The United States was feeding not only its own forces, but those of Britain and the Soviet Union. A report from Buenos Aires summarized the situation bluntly. The United States has achieved the total mobilization of industry without the collapse of civilian life. The contrast to Europe is profound. This was the line that most disturbed Canaris. He knew it was true. Germany's armaments production depended on slave labor, shortages, and coercion, systems that exhausted the nation even as they expanded it. America, by contrast, had managed to grow stronger the longer the war continued. In his private diary, Canaris noted, "They produce with laughter. We produce with fear, and fear breaks faster." He never shared that thought with Hitler. In early 1944, Canaris arranged for one final verification, an aerial reconnaissance mission by long-range Focke-Wulf aircraft operating from occupied Norway. The mission never succeeded. American and Canadian air patrols intercepted the flight over the Atlantic. The photographs were lost, but other evidence soon arrived by a different path. Film reels captured from American news agencies in neutral Portugal. The reels, intended for Allied morale, showed brief clips of the Willow Run assembly line, hundreds of workers riveting wings, engines moving on conveyors, finished bombers taxiing out into daylight. When German censors viewed the footage, they assumed it was staged. Impossible, one report read, fabricated with models. Yet to the trained eyes of engineers, the lighting, scale, and motion were unmistakable. The impossible was real. Inside the Reich Air Ministry, Albert Speer finally acknowledged what his spies had confirmed. America's output was beyond calculation. In January 1944, his staff estimated Allied aircraft production at nearly 100,000 planes per year, of which a quarter were heavy bombers, and Ford's Willow Run accounted for a significant fraction. In Speer's words, "We had lost the war not when the armies failed, but when the Americans learned to manufacture faster than we could imagine." But at the time, few dared to speak that aloud. Göring and Hitler still clung to illusions of technological salvation, the jet fighter, the rocket, the wonder weapons that would reverse their fortunes. They never understood that their true enemy was not a machine, but an idea that in free societies, innovation moves faster than fear. By 1944, the truth about Willow Run was no longer a rumor. It was a fact. American bombers were appearing over Europe in numbers that defied arithmetic. Entire squadrons of B-24 Liberators blackened the sky over Hamburg, Bremen, and Berlin. To the men on the ground, it seemed as if the planes were multiplying mid-air. In Berlin's high command, panic mixed with denial. The data pouring in from the Abwehr, from radar stations, from the shattered cities themselves, no longer fit within the ideological framework of the Third Reich. Hitler refused to believe that a democratic nation, one built on individualism, profit, and freedom, could outproduce his tightly controlled Reich. He told his staff, "America is a mongrel nation of merchants. They cannot fight an industrial war." But even as he spoke, the evidence was flying overhead. Albert Speer, now the Minister for Armaments and Production, knew the numbers told a different story. His ministry tracked aircraft losses daily. By the end of 1943, Germany had produced roughly 25,000 aircraft. The United States more than $85,000 every month. Willow Run alone rolled out nearly 700 B-24s, enough to equip an entire bomber division every 4 weeks. Speer's engineers struggled to comprehend how a single facility could sustain such speed. They examined captured American aircraft and discovered something revolutionary. Interchangeable parts, standardized fittings, simplified wiring harnesses. Ford's engineers had redesigned complexity itself. Instead of hundreds of unique fasteners, There were dozens. Instead of handcrafted assemblies, there were jigs and templates anyone could use. The result was not beauty, but velocity. Speer tried to replicate it. He ordered his own team to study American-style assembly lines. Yet the attempt failed almost instantly. Germany lacked the materials, the labor stability, and, most critically, the trust. Skilled craftsmen resented being replaced by machines. Managers hoarded information to protect status. Slave laborers, starved and abused, had no reason to care about efficiency. The Nazi state could demand obedience, but it could never inspire cooperation. In Ford's Michigan factory, tens of thousands of workers, men and women from every background, showed up each morning driven not by fear, but by purpose. In Germany, that concept was alien. As the Allies advanced across Europe, Hitler's circle retreated into delusion. Göring still boasted that his wonder weapons, or the Me-262 jet fighter, the V-2 rocket, would change the war's course. But the numbers from America told a merciless truth. For every Me-262 built, the United States produced 90 P-51 Mustangs. For every V-2 launched, 10,000 tons of Allied bombs fell on Germany. Ford's assembly lines, along with Boeing's in Seattle and Douglas's in California, had become the decisive front. The Reich had no equivalent, only scattered workshops and secret tunnels lit by dim bulbs, where starving laborers tried to imitate what free citizens in Michigan achieved daily. Within the German military, quiet despair set in. Luftwaffe officers began to whisper that the war was unwinnable, not because of courage or tactics, but because of arithmetic. General Galland, the Luftwaffe's chief of fighters, later admitted, "We realized that for every plane we destroyed, America built 10 more. Our courage was irrelevant. This was the invisible battlefield and the place where ideologies clashed not through bullets but through blueprints, and it was on that battlefield that Germany's totalitarian precision was defeated by American improvisation." At Willow Run, production had become poetry. Every 63 minutes, a bomber rolled out the hangar doors and onto the test runway. Test pilots flew them directly from the plant to operational bases in the U.S. or to ferry commands bound for England. Photographs from 1944 show the airfield packed wingtip to wingtip, an ocean of silver aircraft reflecting the sunlight. To the German agents studying these images in Berlin, it was beyond comprehension. One analyst wrote in the margin, "If this is real, we are finished." He was right. Even so, ideology demanded denial. Hitler blamed traitors for exaggerating Allied strength. Propaganda Minister Goebbels ordered all internal reports about American production sealed and labeled for restricted circulation. German newsreels continued to show smiling factory workers and proclamations of record output, even as Speer's own charts revealed catastrophic shortfalls. The more reality intruded, the louder the propaganda became. Meanwhile, Ford's operation was expanding. Willow Run's assembly rate hit its peak in the summer of 1944, one B-24 every 55 minutes. Each aircraft carried 41200 horsepower engines, 6,000 rivets in the wings alone, and enough range to strike any target in occupied Europe once deployed from British airfields. More than 8,600 bombers emerged from the plant. Before the war's end, a single American factory producing more heavy aircraft than the entire Luftwaffe managed in its last 2 years. The German spies who had first dismissed the early reports were now silent. Their final transmissions, preserved in Allied archives, reveal awe rather than hostility. One reads simply, "Ford's factory is the industrial equivalent of Blitzkrieg." Albert Speer would later confess that when he finally saw wartime footage of Willow Run after Germany's surrender, he was overwhelmed. In his memoir Inside the Third Reich, he wrote, "We misjudged what freedom could accomplish. We believed coercion produced efficiency. The Americans proved otherwise." His words became the epitaph of the Nazi war machine, a system crushed not only by Allied armies, but by an idea it could never comprehend, that trust and cooperation could outbuild tyranny. By the time the Allies landed in Normandy, the Luftwaffe's fate was sealed. The sky itself belonged to the factory floor of Michigan. In early 1944, the sky above Europe began to change. It no longer belonged to the Luftwaffe. The clouds filled with the thunder of B-24 Liberators, the very bombers rolling off Ford's assembly line at Willow Run every 55 minutes. Their presence marked the beginning of the end for the Third Reich, and for the men in Berlin who had laughed at the idea of a factory-built bomber. The first large formations of Ford-built Liberators joined 8th Air Force missions from British airfields that January. Within weeks, they were flying deep into Germany, targeting ball-bearing plants, refineries, and aircraft factories. German observers on the ground noticed something uncanny. The bombers all looked identical, as if stamped from the same mold. In a way they were. Each aircraft bore the same precision, the same rivet patterns, same electrical systems, same gun turrets, the result of a production method that had erased human variation. The Luftwaffe's pilots, already stretched thin, found themselves facing endless replacements. No matter how many bombers were shot down, more appeared the next week. The Willow Run B-24s formed the backbone of Operation Argument, better known as Big Week. Between February 20th and 25th, 1944, Allied bombers launched over 3,500 sorties against Germany's aircraft production centers. It was the largest sustained air offensive in history up to that point. Factories in Gotha, Regensburg, and Schweinfurt were leveled. The Luftwaffe, forced into the air to defend them, suffered crippling losses. More than 400 fighters destroyed in less than 7 days. German intercept reports from those missions revealed disbelief at the scale of the formations. The numbers didn't match any previous logic of war. One intelligence summary sent to Berlin during Big Week read, "Enemy heavy bombers appear in quantities exceeding expected replacements. Suggests American capacity for mass aircraft production far beyond current estimates." That was the sanitized version. In private, Luftwaffe staff called it Industrial Armageddon. High above the Ruhr, B-24s flew in endless grids. Their wings caught the sunlight, flashing like mirrors. Below them, German soldiers stared upward at squadrons so vast they stretched from horizon to horizon, living proof that America's assembly lines were now dictating the tempo of the war. Each Liberator carried a payload of 5 tons of bombs. Each was powered by 4 Pratt & Whitney R1830 engines produced at the rate of 1 every 15 minutes in East Hartford, Connecticut. And each one, in mechanical precision, was a perfect twin of the one before it. The Luftwaffe couldn't keep pace. Their aircraft, often assembled by hand in scattered underground facilities, varied in quality and performance. Spare parts were scarce. Pilots waited weeks for new planes. In contrast, America replaced its losses almost instantly. When 60 B-24s went down over Brunswick in 1 week, the gap was filled within 5 days. Willow Run's normal output. To the German command, it was as if the Allies had discovered a way to grow bombers like crops. Captured pilots told interrogators stories that spread disbelief among their captors. They described mile-long factories where entire aircraft moved on conveyor belts, where women built wings and men tested engines in enclosed chambers. One prisoner, a B-24 navigator, recalled an officer inquiring coldly, "How long does it take to build one of these?" When he answered, "About an hour," the officer laughed, then fell silent when he realized the American wasn't joking. For the first time, German officers began to grasp the full meaning of Willow Run, not just its speed, but its philosophy. Industrial democracy had achieved what totalitarian control could not: scale without collapse. By spring 1944, Allied air raids were stripping Germany's war economy bare. The refineries at Leuna, the ball-bearing plants at Schweinfurt, and the aircraft factories at Augsburg were smoking ruins. German production, already strangled by shortages, now faced annihilation from the sky, a sky filled with aircraft that had been built by citizens who had never even seen a battlefield. Albert Speer later wrote, "Every night we counted losses. Every morning the Americans replaced them. That was when I knew the war was lost. He wasn't alone." Interrogated Luftwaffe officers captured after D-Day confessed that morale within their ranks had disintegrated during Big Week. One recalled, "When we saw the bombers forming again over the channel the next day, we understood we were fighting not men but machines. For German intelligence, the confirmation came too late. The aerial photographs smuggled out of neutral Sweden in mid-1944 showed hundreds of completed bombers parked outside Willow Run, nose to tail, ready for flight. The images were shown briefly to Hitler. He refused to believe them. "It is a trick," he said. "No nation can produce machines like that without slaves." But he was wrong. And that was the essence of his failure. The Americans didn't need slaves. They had volunteers, engineers, and dreamers, citizens united by the simple belief that they could outbuild tyranny. And in those endless ranks of bombers that crossed the channel, that belief became steel, wings, and thunder. By the summer of 1944, Willow Run's daily output surpassed the Luftwaffe's entire monthly heavy bomber production. Each plane rolling out of that Michigan factory carried not only bombs, but a message that freedom, once harnessed to purpose, could outproduce any empire built on fear. It was a message that German spies had first doubted, then confirmed, and finally watched destroy everything they had believed about themselves. The factory that shouldn't have existed had become the factory that ended them. By mid-1944, the war in the air had turned into an industrial avalanche. Every morning, the fields of southern England shimmered with aluminum as hundreds of B-24 Liberators and B-17 Flying Fortresses lined up for takeoff. Many bore the small stencil, manufactured by Ford Motor Company, Willow Run, Michigan. For the Luftwaffe's remaining pilots, those words became a nightmare. They could shoot down one, maybe two, but a dozen more would arrive before sundown. The rhythm of the war had changed, a pulse set not by strategy but by machinery, an assembly line that reached from Detroit to the English Channel. In June 1944, during Operation Overlord, that rhythm reached its crescendo. Before a single Allied soldier stepped onto Normandy's beaches, thousands of Willow Run-built B-24s darkened the skies above northern France. Their bomb loads tore apart bridges, fuel depots, and railway lines that supplied the German front. The invasion would not have been possible without them. Each bomber carried 10 men. Each man relied on the precision of millions of hands back in America, riveters, welders, engineers, and machinists who had turned democracy's freedom into the ultimate weapon. And for the first time, German intelligence officers began to confront a realization they had resisted for years. The industrial war had already been lost. Inside the Reich's command bunkers, the reports were devastating. From June to August 1944, Allied factories, many of them supplied or modeled after Willow Run, produced more aircraft than Germany had built in all of 1942. The Luftwaffe's losses at that time were unsustainable. Over 2,000 fighters destroyed in the first 2 months after D-Day. Every time Speer demanded replacements, his production chiefs reminded him that factories could no longer operate under constant bombardment. Oil was running out. Trains stood idle. The Americans, on the other hand, never stopped. Willow Run operated around the clock, its mile-long assembly line illuminated through the night. Even with wartime blackouts, the glow from its windows was visible for miles, a city of light in the Michigan darkness. There were no uniforms inside. Workers wore overalls, headscarves, and oil-stained gloves. Yet their collective output matched entire nations at war. One German report captured by the Allies after the war summarized the shock with a single sentence: "They make war as if it were commerce, and that is why they will win." The Nazi state had spent years preaching that capitalism was decadent, that democracy was weak. But the truth, proven in aluminum and steel, was that freedom had out-engineered tyranny. When the Allies reached Paris and then the Rhine, Luftwaffe officers finally saw what their spies had warned about: formations so vast they blocked the sun. Captured pilot Heinz Knoke, later a memoirist, described his first encounter with a full B-24 formation. They came in squares and lines without end. It was not an air force. It was a moving continent. He and many others realized that the war had become mathematical. Heroism no longer mattered. For every fighter they sent up, there were 10 bombers waiting. For every pilot lost, the Americans had already trained 3 more. When Allied troops captured German archives in 1945, they discovered just how deeply the Willow Run reports had circulated through Nazi intelligence. Dozens of Abwehr summaries detailed Ford's industrial experiment, with precise figures, photographs, and production rates. Some documents bore red ink across the top. Unconfirmed, probable exaggeration. They weren't exaggerations. The Allies had built over 18,000 B-24 Liberators, more than half of them from Ford and its subcontractors. That single aircraft type dropped over 600,000 tons of bombs during the war. It was not a weapon of elegance or speed, but of persistence, the perfect embodiment of the system that had produced it. In April 1945, as the war collapsed, Albert Speer visited Hitler for the last time in the Führer bunker. He brought with him a report comparing German and American industrial output. The figures were catastrophic. "They build airplanes as we once built rifles," Speer told him. Hitler dismissed it. "They have no spirit." But by then, the spirit that mattered was not ideology. It was endurance. While Hitler's empire crumbled under the weight of its own delusions, Ford's Willow Run continued to hum, producing bombers that would never even reach the front, because victory was already within sight. When Germany finally surrendered, many of its surviving officers were interrogated about the American miracle. General Galland spoke plainly. "We underestimated the machine behind their machines." Others were more reflective. In Allied custody, an Abwehr officer admitted, "We had every statistic, population, resources, technology. What we failed to understand was their belief that anything was possible." After the war, when the surviving German leadership saw the full footage of Willow Run and the American assembly lines, the reaction was disbelief mixed with awe. Albert Speer later recalled watching U.S. newsreels showing Ford's women workers guiding bomber wings into place. "I realized then that we had fought not just soldiers, but a civilization built on movement and imagination." He was right. Willow Run was more than a factory. It was proof that freedom could be engineered, that democracy, when organized with purpose, was stronger than any authoritarian order. The very factory German spies had called impossible had become the symbol of everything their ideology denied: equality, innovation, cooperation. And when the final B-24 rolled off its line in June 1945, just weeks after victory in Europe, it wasn't merely the end of a production run. It was the closing act of an industrial war that had remade the modern world. When the guns finally fell silent in May 1945, the factories of America began to quiet too. At Willow Run, the final B-24 Liberator rolled out on June 28, 1945. Aircraft number 18,482, its polished skin reflecting a piece that had been bought with sweat and steel. The mile-long assembly line that had once symbolized unstoppable momentum came to a halt. For the thousands who had built the hourly bomber, it was a bittersweet moment. Workers gathered at the hangar doors, some in uniform, others still in their coveralls, watching the last plane taxi down the runway and lift into the sky. It wasn't just the end of a war machine. It was the end of an era, the moment when American industry proved conclusively that a free people could outbuild any empire. In the months that followed, Willow Run's story took on a new life. The plant that had once produced bombers now stood as a model for a different kind of reconstruction, not just of Europe's cities, but of its economies. Ford's engineers shared their methods with government officials and manufacturers around the world. The techniques refined at Willow Run, modular design, standardized tooling, moving assembly integration, became the foundation of post-war industrial production. Factories that had once built aircraft now built tractors, refrigerators, and automobiles, using the same principles that had powered the arsenal of democracy the United States had emerged from the war with half the world's industrial capacity intact, a staggering advantage that owed much to the systems pioneered inside Willow Run's mile of steel. In Detroit, the automobile industry retooled almost overnight. By 1946, the first post-war Fords and Chevrolets were rolling off the same lines that had once built wings and engines. In Germany, however, the lesson of Willow Run took longer to unfold. In the ruins of Berlin, Albert Speer, now a prisoner at Nuremberg, was forced to confront the full weight of what he had denied. During his trial, prosecutors presented Allied production data, charts showing the exponential rise of American aircraft manufacturing from 1942 to 1944. The sheer volume left even his captors astonished. At its peak, U.S. industry produced 96,000 aircraft per year, half of them bombers. with Ford's Willow Run contributing more than 1/5 of all heavy bomber output. Speer later told his interrogators, "Had we believed our own intelligence reports in 1943, we might have chosen surrender over annihilation." He admitted that ideology had blinded the Reich's leadership to simple arithmetic. In post-war writings, he reflected with rare honesty, "The Americans understood that freedom is the greatest engine of production. We proved that fear is the most efficient destroyer of it." German engineers, scientists, and industrialists captured after the war were introduced to the Allied manufacturing miracle through the Technical Industrial Intelligence Committee, a post-war operation that analyzed U.S. production methods. When they visited surviving American plants, including Willow Run, they found not mysticism, but simplicity, efficiency achieved through trust, standardization, and the creative freedom of workers to solve problems on the spot. One visiting German engineer remarked, "We thought their success was born of machines. It was born of their minds. The lessons would not be forgotten." In the 1950s, as West Germany rebuilt under the Marshall Plan, many of its industrial leaders consciously emulated what they had seen in America: decentralized management, worker consultation, and innovation through competition. Ironically, the very prisoners of ideology who had once doubted democracy now helped rebuild it. Meanwhile, back in Michigan, Willow Run struggled to find a new purpose. In the late 1940s, the facility briefly produced cars under the Kaiser-Frazer Corporation, but it never recaptured its wartime rhythm. The sheer scale of the building, nearly 3.5 million square feet, made it too vast for peacetime commerce. Eventually, portions of the plant were sold or repurposed. During the Cold War, sections were converted for U.S. Air Force research and General Motors transmission production. Still, its legend endured. For those who had worked there, Willow Run was not just a factory. It was a monument to what ordinary people could accomplish when united by purpose. Former workers remembered the long shifts, the constant hum of machines, the smell of hot metal and oil, the taste of cafeteria coffee at midnight, and the unspoken pride of knowing they were building something that mattered. Many of those women, Rosies as the nation came to call them, kept their rivet guns as souvenirs. Some later said that those years were the first time they felt equal, respected and powerful. They had helped win a global war not with rifles, but with wrenches. In Europe, the memory of Willow Run lingered like an unanswered question. How could a democratic system, dismissed as soft and disorganized, have produced such strength? The answer lay not in the machinery itself, but in the culture behind it, a culture that prized invention over obedience and initiative over fear. The same system that allowed a factory worker to suggest a better method for assembling wings was the same system that allowed a society to adapt faster than tyranny ever could. And in that sense, the true victory of Willow Run wasn't measured in bombers built. It was measured in the rebuilding of a world that had nearly destroyed itself. After the war, the mile-long hangar at Willow Run became strangely silent. The machines that had once roared day and night now stood still, their gears coated in dust. Yet the building that had symbolized America's industrial will refused to fade into obscurity. Its story, born in urgency, driven by faith in freedom, began to take on the weight of legend. The post-war years brought both change and uncertainty. Ford's bomber plant, too large and too specialized for peacetime, passed briefly into the hands of Kaiser-Frazer, which tried to convert the complex into an automobile factory. It succeeded for a few years, producing sleek new cars for a hopeful nation eager to move past the scars of war. But the post-war car boom soon outgrew the site. By the 1950s, Kaiser-Frazer was gone, and Willow Run changed hands again, this time to General Motors, which transformed it into a center for research and aircraft component manufacturing during the Cold War. For a generation that had lived through the war, Willow Run became something sacred, not a monument of conquest but of capability. Veterans and factory workers visited in quiet reverence. Some came carrying black and white photographs of themselves standing beside the bombers they'd built. Others came with their children, telling them about the days when ordinary Americans, guided by belief rather than fear, built a machine that helped end the deadliest conflict in history. Across the Atlantic, the echo of Willow Run reached unexpected places. In post-war West Germany, reconstruction was no longer driven by ideology, but by practicality. Under the Marshall Plan, American advisors helped rebuild industries using principles refined in wartime Detroit: mass production, decentralized management, and worker cooperation. Former German engineers who had once doubted the Willow Run reports now studied its blueprints. The very system they had ridiculed, a network of autonomous workers solving problems creatively, became the basis of West Germany's economic miracle. Factories in Stuttgart, Wolfsburg, and Munich began adopting the same methods. Volkswagen, for instance, borrowed Ford's Flowline system to mass-produce the Beetle, soon a symbol of Europe's recovery. In an irony of history, the heirs of the defeated Reich rebuilt their future using the lessons learned from the factory that had humbled them. Meanwhile, in America, Willow Run's memory became a lesson for new generations. By the 1980s, historians began calling it the factory that won the war, documentaries revisited its story, and universities studied its influence on production science. The plant itself continued to evolve. GM converted portions into an aircraft engine facility for jet research. During the 1990s, parts of the structure were leased to smaller manufacturers, but the sheer scale of Willow Run remained awe-inspiring. 3.5 million square feet of riveted history. In 2011, long after the final machine had stopped humming, preservationists and veterans groups began a campaign to save what remained. The Yankee Air Museum launched an ambitious project to restore a section of the original plant as an educational center. Donations poured in men from families of former workers, from historians, and even from modern automakers who saw in Willow Run the roots of everything American manufacturing had become. They saved a 150,000 square foot portion of the original structure, the very section where final assembly once took place, ensuring that the spirit of Willow Run would live on. Today, that preserved space serves as a museum and teaching ground, a place where students and visitors can walk the same floor, where democracy once proved its strength through labor. The rest of the world, too, continues to draw meaning from Willow Run's legacy. Historians see it as more than an industrial triumph. It was a moral statement. It showed that efficiency need not come from oppression, that coordination could emerge from liberty, and that creativity, not coercion, was the ultimate source of strength. The German spies who once filed their impossible reports could never have imagined that their mythical factory would one day symbolize not just victory, but unity, because Willow Run did more than produce bombers. It produced belief. It proved that when people are trusted, they can achieve the impossible. And in the quiet hum of that Michigan hangar, beneath steel beams that once trembled with life, the echo of that belief still lingers. In the vast timeline of the Second World War, Willow Run was not a battlefield. No soldiers fought there. No flags were raised in victory. Yet inside that mile-long building, a different kind of war was fought and won every single hour. The men and women who worked there never heard the front lines, but they felt them in every rivet, every shift, every roar of a newly built bomber taking flight into the Michigan sky. They were not warriors in uniform, but in coveralls, wielding not rifles, but wrenches and courage. Their victory was measured not in captured cities, but in time. 63 minutes. The rhythm of freedom outpacing tyranny. For the German agents who once called it impossible, Willow Run became proof of something they had never understood, that democracy's strength does not lie in control, but in trust. It is the permission to imagine, to invent, to question, to fail, and to try again, that turns ordinary people into an unstoppable force. Even the most devoted servants of the Reich, men like Albert Speer, would one day admit that what defeated them was not just American technology, but the idea behind it, a belief that liberty itself could be engineered into motion. And perhaps that is the true legacy of Willow Run, not the bombers, not the records, not even the victory, but the revelation that free hands and free minds can build faster, stronger and longer than fear ever could. The war ended long ago, but the echo of that revelation remains. It hums quietly wherever people create, innovate, and refuse to accept impossible. Because in that Michigan field, amid steel and sweat, humanity learned something profound, that the greatest weapon ever built was not made of metal but of belief.